This lesson is from the course Redemptive History and the Regulative Principle of Worship, taught by Dr. Will Wood.
Right, through the Bible, worship by a holy people in a holy place is also conducted on a revealed temporal pattern. There is a win to worship, and this win of worship ultimately looks forward to a time frame of worship that is perfect and perpetual in the kingdom of eternal praise in the new heavens and the new earth. It's significant that the first thing sanctified by God is time. That when God established the Sabbath ordinance in Genesis 2, verses 1 and 3, He blessed the seventh day and made it holy. This act orients time itself around the principle of worshiping God, such that all of life and all of time is meant to be ordered for the act of praise. The sabbatical ordinance given in Genesis 2, 1 through 3 is meant to have a single day focus for an all of life reality lived before the presence of God, a special sanctity of one day for the sake of corporate worship to guide all of life for devotion unto the Lord. As we discussed in a previous lesson, uniting together the ideas of the broad and narrow concepts of worship. But more than just orienting all of life today in a lifelong cadence of sabbatical worship, the sanctification of certain days or a day over others serves to point mankind's worship forward to an eschatological age of praise. Sanctified time today calls the worshiper to look forward to a day when all of time would be sanctified, an eternal Sabbath rest of perpetual praise to our Creator, our Redeemer. And so in order to look at this Sabbath principle together in Scripture, we'll consider first the Sabbath as a creation ordinance, second, Israel's sabbatical calendar, third, worship on the Lord's Day, and then finally, the eternal Sabbath in the new heavens and the new earth. Well, first, considering Sabbath as a creation ordinance. Creation climaxes in Sabbath. The order of the creation week in a 6+1 pattern draws our attention to the climactic seventh day when God finishes His cosmic labors and sits enthroned over all of heaven and earth. It is, in a sense, His session upon Mount Eden. If you remember from our discussion of the tabernacle, the sabbatical legislation and the filling of the tabernacle with the presence of God corresponded to one another in the book of Exodus. Well, in the book of Genesis, I don't think we should be too far away from that either, where the Sabbath day, more than just a sanctified time, is an enthronement time, an enthronement day that sets up the cadence of worship, where man's life on earth is to follow the pattern of God's cosmic labors from work to enthronement rest. This is why the fourth commandment, I believe, reflects back upon the creation week. It calls man to follow the pattern of God. As God's completed cosmic labors and then resting, sanctifying that seventh day, so also man's labor is meant to follow a 6-day pattern and then cease from those labors and sanctify the seventh day as holy unto the Lord, to recognize the heavenly session of the Lord of glory and praise the one who is enthroned over heaven and over earth. Recognizing this pattern in creation and its reflection upon in the fourth commandment leads credence to the idea that Sabbath is a creation ordinance. That is, an ordinance that comes from the alpha point of creation, from this time forward, that man is commanded to follow. Now, for something to be a creation ordinance doesn't mean that you have to have an explicit statement of a command like thou shalt follow the Sabbath, which you don't find in Genesis chapter 1 or 2. But it may be, and this is where I think we find ourselves for this discussion, deduced from good and necessary consequence. See, for the Sabbath, there is a call to a sabbatical ordering of protological worship that comes from the need for man to order his weekly life after God's creational work. God's pattern of work unto sanctified rest provides the archetypal pattern for our life of work unto sanctified rest in worship. And following the overarching thesis of this course, God's rest in Genesis 2 verses 1 through 3 can be described as an archetypal pattern or a heavenly session, a heavenly rest that we are called on earth to pattern our worshipful life after. And so the cessation of God's work on the seventh day and His sanctification, His setting apart of the seventh day, gives us a pattern to follow in our earthly lives, and such as His work was finished, leading unto a sanctification of time, so also our work on earth is to finish, to lead to a sanctification of a particular day. John Murray, in his work on principles of Christian conduct, has a good discussion on Sabbath as a creation ordinance, where I think he properly states that in the transcendent realm of God's opera ad extra, on the grand plane of His creative action, He rested on the seventh day. And God's mode of operation is the exemplar on the basis of which the sequence of man is patterned as a heavenly rest and creation ordinance. The weekly Sabbath that we are to follow on earth is a copy of this heavenly reality. As Meredith Kline says in his work Images of the Spirit, the weekly Sabbath is a copy of the glory temporally translated as a sabbatical day to the Lord. And so the creation ordinance of Sabbath calls man's worship on earth to be conducted to the pattern of God's heavenly enthronement. And we also learn from Genesis 2 verses 1 through 3 a central concept of the Sabbath ordinance, where Sabbath is not, as Murray would say, a rest of inaction. Sabbath instead is the cessation of one type of action for the engagement in another. In Genesis, God ceases His creative labors and engages in the act of blessing and sanctifying the seventh day as the time for worship. Well, so also man. In the Sabbath, we are not called to inaction, but rather to the cessation of ordinary labors for the sake of praising our Creator and our Redeemer. This dovetails well, I think, with the way that we conceived of Sabbath as an enthronement day for the Creator God. The enthronement day of Genesis 2 verses 1 through 3 becomes the worship day for creators before praising their Creator and their King. So Kline again helpfully comments saying, observance of the Sabbath by man is thus a confession that Yahweh is the Lord and Lord of all lords. Sabbath keeping expresses man's commitment to the service of his Lord. And because of that, obedience to this Sabbath ordinance functions to orient all of life in submission to the Lord of glory. Now, while Genesis 2 verses 1 through 3 clearly deals with the sanctification of the seventh day as a Sabbath unto the Lord that man is called to follow, mimicking the pattern of God in creation in his worshipful life on earth, that's not the only significant reference to time in the creation accounts. Drawing our attention to the broader creation narrative now, it's significant to recognize that days 1, 4, and 7 are all about time. It's temporally oriented with the creation of light and the dividing of night and day 1, the creation of luminaries that govern the progress of seasons and days and years, day 4, and the sanctification of time on the Sabbath in day 7, which means the first, the middle, and the last day of creation all deal with time. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 19 in particular, the Lord creates the luminaries and expressly states there that the luminaries are to rule over the day and the night. They are to govern time. And to do this, they are to separate the day from the night, and they are for signs, for seasons, for days, and for years. The luminaries provide the daily and the seasonal cadence for the life of mankind. And we need to remember for this that these luminaries are the macrocosmic temple lamps created by God and placed in creation to govern the time of worship. And placed within the overarching sabbatical structure of Genesis 1, these luminaries and their governance of time serve a liturgical purpose. And that their governance of time provides the necessary contours to answer the question of the when of worship. In fact, the term translated seasons in Genesis 1:14 is very revealing for this thesis. Moed, the term translated seasons here, occurs 160 times in the Pentateuch, 223 times in the Old Testament. It's remarkable that of those 160 times in the Pentateuch, there is not a single occurrence of seasons in terms of the seasons of a year, spring, summer, fall, or winter, for example. It's simply not used in that way. Instead, the term generally considered has a notion of meeting or of appointment. It is a term of association. In fact, 135 times of those 160 uses of the term in the Pentateuch occur in the phrase, the tent of meeting, which is the place of God's special dwelling with His people, the place of appointed meeting. But apart from its use in that phrase, it carries the notion of appointed meeting time. Leviticus 23:2, for example. These are the appointed feasts, moed is the term there, of the Lord, that you shall proclaim as holy convocations, they are my appointed feasts. Moed, same term, showing up again. And so you'll notice a connection here. At the tent of meeting, the ohel moed in Hebrew, there's an appointed time of meeting, a moed. Holy space and sacred time go together. Meredith Klein will call them cosmological coordinates in his article Space-Time on the Genesis Cosmogony. So in Genesis 1, God is creating a holy place to dwell with a holy people, and He's creating time with its appointed seasons and days specifically oriented towards that appointed meeting with the Lord. And so the entire organization and this focus on time that is the first, middle, and last attention point of the creation week is all about organizing a notion for the when of worship. The governance of the luminaries over time is for the when of worship. And lastly, an important element of Sabbath as a creation ordinance also takes us to consider the telos of time. Time itself is eschatologically oriented. See, Genesis 2:1 begins with the sanctification of the Sabbath with how God finishes His creation labors. And so the act of God to create leads to a terminus, to a completion of His creative work. And so Sabbath draws our attention to not only how God is the alpha creator of all things, but also the omega consummator of all things. And so by looking at the creation week itself and the sabbatical ordinance itself, it draws our attention to how we are to think of a telos of time, a goal of time, to look forward to in the new heavens and new earth as a kingdom of eternal and perpetual praise. It calls us to consider eternity. The Sabbath ordinance, you could say, put eternity before Adam and Eve. And it called them to strive to enter into God's Sabbath rest, as the author of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9, considering a call to the church in light of some discussion for the nation of Israel as well. This creation ordinance and this initial, central, and climactic focus on time in Genesis chapter 1 is followed by a remarkable silence about the when of worship up until the time of Moses. The Bible is silent about the question of the when of worship until the days of Moses, when we actually receive a good bit of information through Israel's liturgical calendar. But that being said, 2 points can be made about the time and worship of the patriarchal period. First, while no specific day is ever mentioned in the narratives of patriarchal worship, those narratives always come in response to God's presence. In Genesis 12, for example, God calls Abram out of the land of Ur of the Chaldeans in the east and brings him to Canaan, which is marked by worship. Upon God's promises reiterated in Genesis 13, it's marked by worship again. In verses 14 through 18, Abram constructs an altar and the territory, the oaks of Mamre, and God approaches him in Genesis 15, which is marked by worship in the covenant ceremony. And the pattern goes on from there, that whenever God approaches his people, God's appointment and approach is the time of worship. But even in light of that, a second thing that we can say is the absence of information does not necessarily mean the absence of the command. If Sabbath is a creation ordinance, this means that it's going to be an ongoing creation ordinance, an ongoing thing throughout the history of redemption, even if there is not a specific command given in a particular epoch. So John Murray comments on this saying, "The silence of Genesis subsequent to Genesis 2, 2, and 3 proves nothing as to the desuetude of the institution during patriarchal times, nor does it prove ignorance of the ordinance on the part of the patriarchs. It is precarious to base too much on silence. But even if the silence indicates declension, ignorance, and non-observance, this does not remove the creation ordinance, nor does it disestablish its binding obligation." So even though we don't have information explicitly about a Sabbath ordinance in the days of the patriarchs, that doesn't mean it's not an ongoing and enduring ordinance that they should have followed. But Mosaic legislation does give us a good bit of information about the when of worship with Israel's liturgical, or perhaps we could better say sabbatical calendar. This new revelation concerning a sabbatical calendar fits an overarching pattern already established in creation. As we discussed before, holy space and sacred time go together. In Genesis 1:3 to 2:3, God created the protological temple and organized it under the temporal rubric of Sabbath. Now in redemption, the Lord reveals the typological tabernacle and temple, and that tabernacle and temple looks forward to the new heavens and new earth, and so it fits that in the context of the revelation of the typological tabernacle in the days of Moses, that we have a renewed focus on the sabbatical principle coming up once again in redemptive history. This may explain why the patriarchal period is silent on the when of worship, because tabernacle or temple construction and Sabbath commands coincide at the points of both creation and redemption. So, while the revelation of a redemptively regained place of God's presence, or with the revelation of the redemptively regained place of God's presence, we have a renewed focus and centralization of Sabbath legislation that is tied to this typological mode of God's dwelling with his people. So the first and most important legislation concerning the Sabbath ordinance in the days of Moses comes from the fourth commandment, where Israel is called to observe the Sabbath day, and that Sabbath day is grounded in the creation week of Genesis 1. And as such, the creation ordinance, I think, is confirmed in the fourth commandment as an enduring moral law concerning the worship of God. But this sabbatical ordinance is then applied to a distinct redemptive historical epoch with Israel's special sabbatical festivals, ordinances that are signs for the covenant made with Israel. Leviticus 23 is one of the most important passages for outlining Israel's sabbatical calendar. And Leviticus 23 verses 1 through 2 begins with this organization of these appointed feasts of the Lord, which then begins with the Sabbath in Leviticus 23:3. And the order, I think, is programmatic. The Sabbath command itself provides the proper theological lens with which to understand the other feasts, making the other feasts Sabbaths, plural, to the Lord. The organization of these other feasts under a Sabbath rubric of 7 confirms this thesis for us. Now, the Passover feast, revealed in Leviticus 23, 4 through 8 for this chapter, you can also read Exodus 12 for it, happens on the 14th day of the first month. And joined to it is also the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which continues for the next 7 days until the climactic Sabbath day, Leviticus 23, 8. The Feast of First Fruits is tied together to the harvest, so it's a season of the harvest given to them in the land. But the Feast of the First Fruits is then tied to the Feast of Weeks, which happens 7 Sabbaths, often translated as weeks there, but it's actually Sabbaths from the first fruits, Leviticus 23, 15 through 22. The first day of the 7th month is the Feast of Trumpets, Leviticus 23, 23 through 25. The Day of Atonement, Leviticus 23, 26 through 32, is on the 10th day of the 7th month, and it's called a Sabbath of solemn rest, and keeping it means to keep your Sabbath, Leviticus 23, 32. The Feast of Booths, Leviticus 23, 33 through 36, is 5 days after the Day of Atonement as a 7-day feast with the 8th day as a solemn assembly. Then to round everything out, Leviticus 23:38 calls all of Israel's festivals Sabbaths, plural. So the various feasts of Israel were their Sabbaths, appointed feasts, revealed by God as an expression of Sabbath in the life of Israel. It is a sabbatical calendar. But it's a sabbatical calendar that is tied to their specific redemptive historical context as what we could call a ceremonial expression of the moral law. The Passover, for example, is a celebration that commemorates the Lord's redemption of Israel out of the land of Egypt as the paradigm event of salvation for the Old Covenant period. Seeing it as it is tied to that specific redemptive event for that particular people, it is a statute, Exodus 12:14 even says, that is for the generations of Israel. It's tied to that redemptive historical epoch. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is also related to the Passover and how Israel was brought out of Egypt by a strong hand. The Feast of First Fruits and the Feast of Weeks are tied to Israel's land inheritance and to the reaping of the harvest that is brought before the priesthood, Leviticus 23:10. The Day of Atonement is part of Israel's sacrificial system at the tabernacle and later at the temple. That's associated with a yearly need to purify the holy place of God's holy dwelling, a legislation precipitated by the deaths of Nadab and Abihu. You can read Leviticus 16:1 for that connection. And the Feast of Booths is connected to Israel's sojourn in the wilderness, Leviticus 23:42. And so Israel's feasts, their Sabbaths, are connected to the Lord's works of salvation for the nation of Israel. They are tied to this specific redemptive historical epoch as a special win of worship for this particular age. These feasts, minus the weekly Sabbath, were also new to the people of God at this time. The patriarchs did not observe these various feasts, nor did Israel during their time in Egypt up until the administration of the Passover in Exodus chapter 12. The feasts are an outgrowth of the Lord's redemptive work, ordained by God to give a yearly cadence to Israel's life where they, through worship, recollect the wonderful works of God to save. And so, the observance of these festivals is tied to the Old Covenant Israel, especially to the events of the Exodus and the establishment of the tabernacle and the temple with its particular priesthood. Israel, on top of the weekly Sabbath, had these other yearly Sabbaths that they were called to observe. But Israel's sabbatical calendar also extended beyond the year. It included a cycle in the years of 7, where every 7th year was a sabbatical year to the Lord. Leviticus 25, verses 1 through 7, and Deuteronomy 15 outline this for us. Then after 7 groups of sabbatical years, there is the year of Jubilee in Leviticus 25, 8 through 22. Every 7th year, as this Sabbath year to the Lord, was a rest for the land as a Sabbath to the Lord. This rest for the land is one where Israel was not allowed to sow in the field or to prune the vine. The Sabbath of the land, as Leviticus 25:6 calls it, provides the food for Israel on its own, and therefore calls Israel to trust in God's provision of food even in the land. That the land has its Sabbath here is also very significant. Remember, time and space go together. Holy space and sacred time are similar and interjoined considerations. And so when we're thinking about the land having a Sabbath, we are to understand the land inheritance as a Sabbath inheritance. It is a Sabbath place for the Sabbath time of praise. This is perhaps even connected together to the additional legislation in Deuteronomy 15 connected to the sabbatical year. We're on top of the rest for the land that is applied in Leviticus 25. There is also a release of debt and slaves in order to maintain the proper inheritance of the people of Israel in Deuteronomy 15. The people, the place, and the time of worship go hand in hand. The sabbatical year is for the land, and the land is a land of Sabbath rest for God's people. After 7 sabbatical years, there is an ultimate sabbatical year in the year of Jubilee, Leviticus 25, 8 through 22. In the Jubilee year, on the Day of Atonement, liberty is proclaimed throughout the land such that any property that is bought throughout the region or throughout the territory of Israel during the last 49 years, it returns back to its original clan, to its original owner, thereby preserving the original allotments given to the nation of Israel in the days of Joshua. I'll put it a little bit differently, thereby preserving the promises given to the patriarchs concerning this particular land. Again, holy space and sacred time go together. You see, Israel's liturgical life was to be sabbatically oriented. All of the feasts, in one fashion or another, are redemptive historical applications of the sabbatical principle that recollect the Lord's wonderful work to save the people of Israel through the event of the Exodus and bring them into the land that was promised to the patriarchs. These particular feasts are therefore tied to the Old Covenant Israel, their national redemption from Egypt, to their land inheritance, and to the tabernacle and temple worship with its priesthood. Now, I want to qualify this very briefly here and say, because it's commanded doesn't mean that it was always followed. There's a significant problem in Israel's worship where they don't always keep the sabbatical commands of the Lord. Just go read Ezra and Nehemiah and see the confrontation that they have against the people for violating the Sabbath. When we're looking at these principles for worship, we're not looking for something so much about what Israel did as much as what they were commanded to do. And so when we're looking at these, we do see a distinctive command from God to follow these sabbatical patterns. And when worship shifts to the New Covenant era, from worship at the earthly temple to worship in the heavenly temple, there's also going to be a corresponding shift to the temporality, to the when of worship. Now, the enduring principle of God regulating a time for praise will continue, but the specific manifestation of that time will change. So now, considering the question of worship in the New Covenant age, or worship on the Lord's Day as a Christian Sabbath, whether or not Christians must follow a Sabbath is an oft-posed question. But as Hebrews 9 states, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And as the author of Hebrews continues in chapter 4, verse 11, he gives a charge to the church saying, "Let us therefore strive to enter that rest." See, for this injunction to be true, there must be an enduring Sabbath command and hope for the people of God today. If you want a really good article on that, Richard Gaffin has one that you can go examine for yourself. And so the question then is, in what manner is the sabbatical order intact? And the answer lies in that Christians are called to worship the Lord on the Lord's day. They are to sanctify this day as one where they are to cease their worldly labors and recreations and join the chorus of heaven and the church on earth, praising our Creator and our Redeemer. The sabbatical principle from creation continues into the Lord's Day worship of the church today. And New Covenant worship is consistently conducted on the Lord's Day, language we get from Revelation chapter 1, verse 10. And the Lord's Day is Sunday. We've already observed from other lessons that Acts 2:42 provides kind of a rubric for worship in the New Covenant, where it talks about the worship through the gathering of the saints, the breaking of bread, the hearing of apostolic teaching, and of prayer. It's significant then that in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, it continues on to say, quote, "On the first day of the week, when we gathered to break bread, Paul taught with them." Do you see the association? It's actually a continuation of Acts chapter 2, isn't it? The same language is used here with the addition of the specific time frame of when the early church was doing this gathering. It was on Sunday that the people gathered together for the breaking of bread and the Lord's Supper. It was on Sunday that the Apostle Paul instructed them in this passage until midnight, so no complaining about long sermons anymore, folks. It's also on the first day of the week that the people would gather together to worship through giving in 1 Corinthians 16:2. And so this establishes a pattern where New Covenant churches gather together on the first rather than the last day of the week for corporate worship. But what is it that constitutes the change from Saturday to Sunday? Well, there's no explicit command that says, "Thou shalt now shift the day to Sunday." Those above passages clearly show a pattern deduced from good and necessary consequence of worship on the Lord's Day. This worship then is a gathering where the time frame of worship has changed due to a new redemptive historical circumstance, namely the climax of redemption in light of Christ's resurrection from the dead. And this change in time in light of a work of God in redemption actually follows an Old Testament pattern. If you ever paid attention to the legislation concerning the Passover in Exodus chapter 12, in Exodus chapter 12, God legislates a new calendar for the people of Israel, where he actually tells them in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 2 that the Passover now becomes the mark of the first month of the year. Time itself, liturgically considered, is reoriented around the worship. Same thing in this new covenant context. In God's redemptive work, the time of worship is reoriented to match that work. The Lord, having finished the work of redemption in the death and resurrection of Christ, reorients time itself, reorients the win of worship for the redeemed community around that salvific event. And so just as Israel's sabbatical calendar was organized to recollect the Exodus event, so also the church sabbatical calendar, the Lord's Day, recollects the greater event of redemption in the death and resurrection of Christ. See, this shift in the time frame of worship is significant for the worship of Christ's church. It tells us about who we are as worshipers in spirit and in truth, drawn up into the heavenly presence of God. See, Christ's resurrection is the first fruits of the great resurrection harvest that is to come at the end of the age. He is the firstborn among many brothers. And so for Christ to be first fruits means that for us to be in Christ, we partake of, or we have a part of His eschatological resurrection harvest. For Him to be firstborn shows that believers are adopted into sonship in Christ, which means that these firsts, Christ being the first fruits, the firstborn, shows us that with the resurrection of Christ, from the day of his resurrection, the great end-time resurrection harvest has begun. It's begun first with him, and it will be applied to all those who are in him at the end of the age. And so the worshiping church of today worships as an eschatological people united to a resurrected and ascended Savior, gathered to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, Hebrews 12:23. And so Christian worship is oriented to the eschatological assembly and partakes of the Sabbath glory of heaven each Lord's day. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, and the Sabbath command shifts in accord with this Lord's redemptive work. Put most simply, Christians no longer worship on the last day of the first creation. They worship on the first day of the last creation. Worship on the seventh day of the creation we commemorated the creative work of God who made all things out of nothing, and its application to the Old Testament, to Israel's sabbatical calendar, highlighted God's work as both creator and redeemer. To worship now on the Lord's Day marks our calendars and marks our cadence of worship in light of the new creation, in light of Christ's resurrection from the dead. So it's joined to him by the power of the Spirit. We are joined to the first fruits of the resurrection, to the firstborn among many brothers. And because of that, the wind of worship shifts toward that eschatological age. From the last day of the first creation to the first day of the last creation. Now, some may contend that while worship on the Lord's Day is proper, it need not be called a Sabbath, and it need not be an application of the fourth commandment, nor a creation ordinance. And often this argument is based on what I would think is faulty exegesis of Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, where Paul says there that none are to pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon, or, I'll give the ESV translation, a Sabbath. And these are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Now the argument goes that since Christ, the substance, has come, the Sabbath ordinance has itself been done away with. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily what Paul is talking about here. See, Paul is dealing specifically with Judaizers who insist on following Israel's sabbatical calendar, which I think is pretty clear in how he mentions festivals and new moons along with the Sabbath. The language then seems to be particularly tied to Israel's sabbatical calendar, the various sabbatical feasts that were unique to that period of redemptive history, which have gone away in light of the climax coming and being fulfilled in the person and work of Christ. And I think it's significant that unlike the ESV's translation of Sabbath in the singular, that in Colossians 2:16 it is actually Sabbaths in the plural. And as we saw before, Israel's sabbatical calendar was a ceremonial application of the enduring moral law unique to that particular period of redemptive history and was called Sabbaths, plural. The moral law and the fourth commandment and the creation ordinance that undergirds it remain in effect as the ceremonial application of it is fulfilled by Christ. So Paul's charge here is that Christians should not follow Israel's sabbatical calendar. He is not arguing that there is no enduring Sabbath ordinance or implication. Because of that, I do believe it is perfectly appropriate to call the Lord's Day the Christian Sabbath, to set apart and to sanctify this day as the particular day of worship for the people of God in a proper redemptive historical application of the fourth commandment in God's moral law. And maintaining this connection, maintaining the idea of the Lord's Day as a Christian Sabbath ties us together to the rich Sabbath theology of the Bible that takes us to consider how the whole of time and the whole of history from creation forward is moving to the goal of Sabbath rest and the eternal sabbatical kingdom of the new heavens and the new earth. You see, Sabbath and eschatology go hand in hand. Even the original sabbatical ordinance that we talked about before, earlier on in creation itself, was taking us to consider the consummation of all things. So the cessation, the finishing of God's original creation work in Genesis 2, 1 through 3, takes us to consider the finishing of all things as He brings in and inaugurates the new heavens and the new earth. The original, the protological, was always meant to give way to the eschatological. History is a Sabbath history, and it takes us to consider the hope of the sabbatical kingdom that is yet to come in the new creation, an eternal Sabbath kingdom. See, holy space and sacred time go together. And when we're thinking about the eternality of the sabbatical ordinance being expressed in the new heavens and the new earth, it is a sabbatical time, but it is also a sabbatical place of perfect rest in the presence of God, where all the strivings and all the angst and all the work that we do in this age gives way to eternal Sabbath rest in the new heavens and the new earth, a kingdom of perfect and perpetual righteousness and praise that endures for all time. The Sabbath ordinance, from creation forward, including the Lord's Day Sabbath today, sows in the hearts of Christians the hope of heavenly glory, of basking in the light of God's presence in the place of perfect beatitude, the goal of the Levitical blessing that God's face may shine upon us as He is gracious to us. So part of the significance of worshiping God on the Lord's Day is that through this worship, the believer is brought into that Sabbath day. The eternal Sabbath, you can say, breaks forth into the life of the believer. It invigorates them to live the life of faith today as we strive to enter the rest of God in sight in the new heavens and the new earth. The creation ordinance, Israel's sabbatical calendar, and Lord's Day worship takes God's people heavenward, and it gives us the hope of glory and the time of ascent up that heavenly mountain.
Thank you for listening to this lesson from Reformed Academy. We trust it has been a blessing to you, and we encourage you to use this course in your church or otherwise share it with others who may benefit from this teaching. At Reformed Forum, we are committed to providing redemptive historical, biblical, and theological education freely to people around the world. All of our courses are available online at reformedforum.org, many with Spanish and Chinese subtitles, all entirely for free. If you would like to support our mission and help us continue offering these valuable resources, please visit reformedforum.org/donate. With your partnership, more people can access sound, Reformed teaching, and together, by God's grace, we can equip the next generation of church leaders for faithful service.